Everybody can take their seats. Welcome to the Transportation Committee meeting of September 28th, 2016. I'm Councilman Mike Bonham, the chair, along with my colleagues Nuri Martinez and Jose Weezer. Mr. Vu should be joining us shortly. Let's get started with our customary opening, the multimodal roll call. In the past 2 weeks, who has commuted by train? Okay, the DOT side of the room is looking good. Bus? Okay. Oh, sorry, yeah. Pedestrian? Come on, you're all pedestrians. We do this every time. Okay, let's get straight to business here. Colleagues, I am going to recommend that we put on the consent agenda items 1 through 4 and 6 and 7.
7.
Is that okay, Ms. Martinez?
Yes.
Okay. So direction of the committee will be to approve items 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, and 7.
I have an addition to item 3.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we'll do item. So that will leave as a balance of the agenda 3, 5, and 8.
Okay.
And I'm going to start as a courtesy to Mr. Harris Dawson with item number 5.
Item number 5 is a Harris-Dawson Blumenfeld motion relative to amending Los Angeles Municipal Code Section 87.55 to prohibit the parking of vehicles with for sale signs on both sides of Southwestern Avenue between West Manchester Avenue and West Century Boulevard.
Thank you. Before I start, let me just ask if anybody has speaker cards for general public comment. Please submit them now, because I'm going to close the window for that in just a second. Good afternoon, Mr. Harris Dawson. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair and members of the Transportation Committee. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to give testimony on item number 5, which was related to item number 4, Western Avenue in Council District 8. It is the longest main street in the Council District. It's one of the longest streets in the district. It goes from the port all the way up to Griffith Park. Because the street was built as a transportation corridor, the regulations on parking and posting of signage has become a problem over the years as it's become more residential. And so we've asked this committee and the council to create policies that make it more like a residential or commercial business street. So forbidding for sale signs on cars for people using it as for sale lots, prohibiting the parking of large oversized vehicles, particularly mobile homes is a particular problem. They create blind spots along with trash, so on and so forth. And so we thank you for your consideration of this and want to let everybody know that in the Homelessness and Poverty Committee, one of the things we want to consider very, very soon is a safe parking program for the city, because we know because we move these people off Western doesn't mean that they're going to disappear into thin air. They're going to show up somewhere. So again, thank you all for your speedy consideration of this matter, and we look forward to participating in a citywide conversation about it, as it's a problem in more places than just this. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have, the other speaker card is a member of your staff. I presume probably not going to comment. Okay. Do we have a motion to approve?
Well, Mr. Chair, I think we need to, there needs to be some evidence provided that the city attorney needs to document the need to do the prohibition against for sale vehicles.
There are photographs that need to be introduced.
Okay. They have been introduced.
To testify that of the problems that they've encountered on the road. That would be great.
So we have the photo. Mr. Harris Dawson has testified. Is that sufficient?
Excuse me.
Hi, I'm Crystal Killian with the Department of Transportation. I'd like to submit the photos and introduce that there are problems with the parking of oversized vehicles as well as vehicles for sale on Western Avenue.
Thank you very much. All right. So with that, the motion has been moved and seconded, and we're on the verge of approving. Mr. Gershwin, would you have a public comment card on this? Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Item 8. Yes, right. Okay, great. Thank you. All right, so this item is moved, seconded, and approved. Thank you. That brings us to item number 3.
Item number 3 is an O'Farrell-Rue motion relative to establishing a regulatory framework for sightseeing bus operations in the city of Los Angeles.
Okay, Mr. Weezer?
Yes, thank you, and I want to thank the makers of this motion, and I wanted to ask staff if they could, actually in Eagle Rock, we have charter buses that are loading people up on the streets and taking them to casinos. This has had an impact on local traffic patterns, and so with this motion, we just wanted to add if they could ask DOT to look into what we can do about buses, charter buses pulling up on the side in Eagle Rock, and we could just get a report back on that, work with my staff on what we can do about that.
I have a question.
Yes.
I have similar concerns, but what type of permits does a tour operator need to operate within the city limits? Is there anybody here from the department?
Dan?
I don't know where these tour companies are coming from, how they operate. They can't just have their folks park in our library parking lots and then pick up people and then bring them back. I mean, apparently that's how they do it. I've witnessed them.
Dan Mitchell with the Department of Transportation. So I'm not familiar with the requirements for those tour buses. My understanding is they would be regulated by the PUC. Our role as in the Department of Transportation would be to provide parking spaces for those buses, but we wouldn't regulate them under the department's authority. So our involvement has been limited to,
Right,
to
and that's
parking
why
regulations.
Things could get out of control. So then how does the city have the ability to impose additional regulations?
So I know that there's staff that's working on this particular problem, and we're going to include that information in the report back, how those buses can be regulated, and we'll include the appropriate departments with that.
Because one, I agree with Mr. Weezer, there's significant impact in terms of traffic, but there's also a parking impact. Because in some of the, what I've witnessed is, for example, if they were to park in a parking lot and they choose to do so by picking them up in front of a library, then they impact that library and its patrons in order for them to find parking. So it's an ongoing issue.
Yes. The other issue we've seen is that when they choose to do that, then parking spaces where they create their de facto stop get filled and remain filled for much of the day. Right.
And it impacts street parking as well. Okay. When do we expect to report back on this?
I believe it's 60 days.
Okay.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, Mr. Rue.
if I could add, thank you. We actually, the chair has agreed, there's a motion that was introduced earlier that I've been working on where we're trying to get some regulatory teeth. And to answer that question, I've also met with Assemblymember Adrian Nazarian to work with it. And currently, all those tour bus operators are regulated under the PUC. So we've been working with the State Assembly office to see what they could do to give more local jurisdiction. That's more of a longer-term legislative fix. But I've been working with the City Attorney's Office and DOT to report back on the tour bus operators and how we could actually give our law enforcement some teeth or enforcement mechanism so we could crack down on them. And the chairman has agreed that when this report comes back, it'll be heard together with the previous motion. So hopefully they'll give us more options for us to crack down on these tour operators.
So do you feel that you've received enough direction now to provide a report back?
Yes, ma'am.
So, yeah, to recap, what the report asked for is DOT to report back with recommendations that allow the city to safeguard public and passenger safety and coming up with a regulatory framework, recommendations for minimizing nuisance and unauthorized activities, recommendations for any necessary state and or federal regulatory and legislative changes, best practices in sightseeing bus regulations employed in other cities, and recommendations to address other issues as further described in the text of the motion submitted by Mr. O'Farrell, but also in the conversation here from my colleagues. So,
We got it.
as amended, that's the direction of the committee.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Chair, we'll be holding this in committee.
Yes, with the report back expected in 60 days. And,
I have put in a card for comments on this one. It's number 3, right?
oh, I'm sorry, yes, please come on up, sir.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Godes.
My name is Mohammed Gods. I represent represent Starline Tours, one of the major operators that hopefully some of you have seen and have not crowded your parking lot too much, Councilwoman Martinez. I said, hopefully they have not crowded your parking lot too much. The concern we have here is, first, the notice for today's affair was kind of disseminated yesterday, and I think there are a lot of industry group representatives here, but they didn't have time to get their act together to make comments for your benefit. But just speaking generally and letting you know that there is a problem with this approach. This is a whale that's put on this agenda to attack in a 60-day time to report. We already know that the PUC regulates. I've represented transportation companies before the PUC for over 20 years. PUC regulates charter companies, tour companies. They have various levels of authorities they grant. Department of Transportation does. Charter business that
Thank you.
Councilman referred to is regulated under different
Thank you.
body.
Time is up.
I beg your pardon?
Time is up.
May I have a couple of seconds?
I'm sorry, can't make exceptions because I'm going to have to do it for everybody.
Well, you should include the industry group, the industry group.
So that's a fair point. First, I want to indicate that the agenda was not released yesterday. The agenda was released Friday. But I'm happy with the committee's concurrence to ask DOT to work with and consult with the industry before submitting its report. And there'll be certainly plenty of time for everybody involved to comment on any report or recommendation once it comes to committee. This is only at this point asking them to begin to draft the report. There'll be plenty of discussion, I'm sure, on whatever recommendations come back. You're welcome. All right, that brings us now to item number 8.
Item number 8 is a DOT report in response to a Weezer bond motion relative to instructing DOT in coordination with Street Services and the Department on Disability to report on the status of installing on-street blue curbs to create disabled parking spaces and recommendations to establish a viable blue curb installation program.
Okay, so let me just set this one up a little bit, and thanks for Crystal and Dan for coming to the table to talk about this. This is an issue that should be simple and gets complex rather quickly, and you're going to start throwing acronyms at us at a frightening speed in a few seconds. But let's just sort of set this up as saying that the city used to do a blue curb program. Folks would call council offices and they would get a blue curb, and it happened relatively quickly. And then in 2010, the city stopped providing on-street blue curbs as a service due to the budget cuts. My understanding is in 2012, the city considered reinstating the program but didn't. And since then, a number of us, including Mr. Weezer and myself, have wanted to bring it back. And our understanding is that there have been changes in federal and state law that prevent us from bringing back just a blue curb. We can't do a blue curb without doing other things. So before you get into anything else, could you explain to us what these changes are, who made them, and what the rationale is?
Basically, blue curbs are considered accessible devices for the disabled, and the federal and state legislation is going to a place where they want wheelchair accessibility for these spaces. And so basically the requirements require a nearby access ramp as well as parkway improvements so that the wheelchairs aren't having to go through grass or gravel or other unimproved areas to get in and out of the vehicles.
And these changes were made at what level, the federal or state?
Both.
By Congress and the state legislature, or by regulatory agencies?
Basically, it starts at the Federal Department of Justice through the Access Board, through their access requirements. There's a draft document called PROAG, which talks about public rights-of-way. Technically, it is a draft document, but it is the direction that all departments are going. Caltrans has also adopted those regulations and placed them in documents that control what our agencies do.
So I totally understand the rationale for it, but what it's resulted in is I have constituents who don't use a wheelchair, who have a disability who are calling for a blue curb, and my staff will have to say to them, well, we can't get it done right now because we don't have the funding to install a ramp. And their comment is, well, I don't want a damn ramp. I just want the blue curb. Do the regulations anticipate that, give us any leeway at all, and what response do we give someone in a situation like that?
Basically, the response we get is think of a handicap restroom, that it's available for anyone to use whether or not they're in a wheelchair. But if there is someone with a wheelchair, then it is available and meets their needs. And so while someone may have a mobility limitation and can use that same space, if you are indeed in a wheelchair, you need additional stuff to be able to get on and off to the sidewalk.
Yeah,
But can I add to that,
Yeah,
Mr.
please.
Chair? But when these requests are made, they're made by a specific household. So we know what the disability is. Can't we tailor it to what the needs are so that we don't just, well, we have to do a ramp for everyone? I mean, just in case. We know what the disability is and why the request is coming to us. So can we tailor it to their needs?
Well, public parking is available for anyone in the public to use. It is not a specific individual's parking space, and that's the reason they have to meet these overreaching access requirements.
And that's a federal guideline.
And state, yes.
When did that change, by the way?
In California, it changed, I believe, with our 2006 MUTCD or 2012 MUTCD. I'm not sure when it changed at the federal level, but I know when we started reviewing the policy in 2012, that's when we realized that this change had been made.
Angela, do you have any comments or thoughts?
Yeah, and again, for our department, we have the same issue trying to explain the situation. Unfortunately, anybody can park in a blue space. And so even if it's a residential individual requesting it, just because we put the blue space there doesn't mean that they're going to be the ones using it, because there may be other individuals who have a valid placard who are going to park there, and then we have this little war of, it's my space. Well, no, it's a public space. So it makes it very difficult, and so as Crystal said, they've changed the regulations because, again, we have wheelchairs that are parking in blue spaces that don't have access to the sidewalk. And also, people with disabilities, their needs change over time. So it may be that you have somebody who has a mobility disability, yet a year or two later, they may end up with a walker, and then it progresses to a wheelchair. And so we put in a blue curb without the accessibility. Now they're going to be coming back and asking for it in the roundabout way. So it makes it very difficult. Again, when we get the calls, we try to screen them to find out exactly what the issue is. Many times it's parking because it's a multifamily residential area, and there's just so many people there. The residents, it's more of, they just want a space that they can get in and out of, but more importantly, they want some place to be able to be picked up with access services or paratransit or somebody else in a safe environment. And they think if they have the blue curb, that means that the access service is going to be able to pull up when in fact somebody may be parking there. So it doesn't really meet their needs. So with our department, we go through a full vetting of exactly why they need the space and talk to them about other ways that we may be able to achieve the pickup drop-off in a more safe area, or we'll pull in access services and have a site meeting with them if it's a real problem for the constituent.
Thank you. So let's step back a bit. I wanted to be clear if our current policy is that we have a moratorium. We do. So we're not issuing any. And our reasoning is because of the state and federal guidelines, it has just gone so expensive to do them. So it's an issue of money for us.
I think it's an issue of money and priorities, because DOT can do the paint and sign work, but the other capital improvements fall under the jurisdictions of the Bureau of Engineering and the Bureau of Street Services. And so it truly becomes a multi-agency problem or issue.
Yeah. And what concerns me is that since we saw these issues arise, we haven't attempted to find our way around them. It's almost like there's just a moratorium and we're not doing it anymore. And it's a very frustrating and difficult position to be in when that's what we have to tell our constituents. And we've gotten, in my office at least, I keep asking my staff to come up with an answer like, well, yeah, but when are we going to start complying with the new federal guidelines? And we want to be, at least if my colleagues agree, that we want to find a way to move this forward. And if it's money, let's figure it out and let's get that in the budget. Let's coordinate with other agencies. But we're trying to get to a place where we lift that moratorium. And so in the report that I saw here, the recommendations, I'm not quite sure we're going in that direction. So one thing I wanted to get out of this conversation, Mr. Chair, is how do we start moving in that direction? Because I wasn't quite sure the recommendations from the report that we got is really getting us to how do we get over this moratorium as soon as possible and put a system in place to allow these to continue.
I have an additional question, though. What kind of liability are we facing for not having the accessible parking zone program? I mean, so we put this moratorium, and I agree with Mr. Weezer, but are we opening ourselves up to additional liability in another lawsuit? I mean, that seems to always be the case. In order for us to move forward, we always have to be sued.
I think there is a smaller risk of us being sued on the issue of having the moratorium on the blue curb program than us implementing a blue curb program where we have issues with the broken sidewalks and people can't get to their residences because of other accessibility issues. And so it's a path we have to walk very carefully on.
I do think there's an issue on both directions. I think funding is the main barrier for us right now, is if we had the funding and the departments were able to do the work and we were able to address the needs, I think we would have a program. Not having the program, not having the correct funding for it, yes, I think we are at risk. We are at risk in not possibly the residential areas, but more of the business areas, the marked and parallel parking, and other issues where we're just not able to even put in blue curbs for some of the businesses that are requesting it, or even some of the city facilities that we may need to get some blue curbs in front of.
And have we had a situation where we've received a request for the accessible parking zone, and it conflicts with a bike lane?
We have an issue with the
I mean, that to me is
Reseda bike
another
lane.
issue, because we seem to be expanding our our bike lanes. We want to make sure they connect. But here's another problem that we're going to encounter if we ever lift the moratorium. Are we going to be in conflict with those two things?
No, we're actively working on our bike plan, or bike plans to address the accessibility issues now that we have a better understanding of the regulations. And I don't know if you want to comment on that, Dan.
No, I think Crystal said it clearly. I mean, if we provide parking, and sometimes parking is removed entirely when bike lanes are installed, but if we provide parking, then, and we designate a space for, that is accessible, then we need to meet these guidelines. That's the predicament that we're in. While we want to provide a service that perhaps addresses those that don't require the full accommodation, we're not permitted to do that.
So we do have, there are some issues, not just for accessible parking on bike lanes, but for the access services, the paratransit that drops off and picks people up on the protected areas. So our department's been working very closely with DOT. I've physically gone out with engineers and driven the bike paths to see where we could put in a blue curb or an area for a pickup drop-off. We're asking access services to provide us hot spots on those routes so we know where they are servicing a lot of individuals. So we're trying to address it as much as we can as the bike lanes are rolled out.
Okay.
So that's a related issue, but it's not specifically about accessible, designated accessible parking.
Yeah, but it occurred to me just because we've been talking about bike.
And one more question. With the sidewalk repair program, what drove that was ADA access. And so that may have given us, and as we roll that out, gives us an opportunity to tap into some dollars to coordinate with requests for blue parking zones. So have we coordinated with them? Are we working with the sidewalk repair program?
We have been actively working with the Sidewalk Repair Program and the BOE and BSS partners. We have met, and we do believe that these are separate programs, and they should be administered separately. But there is overlap with both the Sidewalk Repair Program as well as the curb ramp program, and that we should maximize those opportunities. But there may be situations where sidewalk repairs go in, and then maybe a year or 2 years later, someone makes a request for a disabled zone, or it may be that it's not programmed now and someone's requesting the zone, but the accessible sidewalks are several years out. So they really should be parallel but separate programs.
So what you're asking for approval of today is essentially a very bare bones framework. You want to say that the DoD will be in charge of evaluating, and then all the different agencies will work together and make recommendations on where to do these, but there's no funding. That summarize it pretty well?
Basically, yes. And that I believe we want to report back in 45 days and to provide a better framework of what the workflows between our various agencies will be, some recommendations regarding priorities, such as the commercial and or municipal facilities, multifamily residential versus single-family residential. We can report back on the various regulations that affect on-street parking and implementing these programs. And I think we have a view that potentially in the second half of this fiscal year, we might be able to start back some form of the program with knowledge that in the next fiscal year, we may have to request additional resources.
All right. Yeah. Let's have Mr. Gershwin do his public comment, because it may give us something to...
But before you guys go, I have a question.
Okay.
Do we have any grandfather clause for sites that have been installed prior to the new federal guidelines? And are we going to be held liable for that?
Not liable.
I'm waiting for Crystal to answer.
Okay.
Yes, we do have grandfather rules with them, but there are things that may trigger the remediation, and the sidewalk repair program could be one of the things that triggers remediation.
How many do you think we have? Any estimate?
You mean like legacy blue curbs?
No firm estimate, but probably several thousand.
So I do believe that under the Willett settlement, if we are retrofitting a blue curb that's there as part of that sidewalk improvement, that technically should be able to be counted because it's a barrier removal and it's a trigger and it's already there. So I actually think that we could, for the legacy ones, I think there may be a little bit of a difference when it comes to new requests.
Okay, Mr. Gershwin, why don't you come up? Before we start giving recommendations, I want to make sure we hear the public comment.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. David Gershwin here representing Access Services, Los Angeles County's second largest transit agency that transports 4 million passengers with disabilities every year. Just wanted to articulate our general support for additional blue curbs, curb cuts, anything that facilitates ingress and egress for our passengers. As Angela and Crystal have already mentioned, there are often times where the physical lay of the land is such that it's very difficult for our drivers to safely park and allow our passengers to either embark or disembark safely. So we have been working very collaboratively with them around specific spaces on a case-by-case basis, but we'd also, certainly offer to provide guidelines for best practices moving forward. So once again, we support the extension of this program, recognizing the funding issues and challenges that you face.
Thanks. Sure. Question for Crystal. You just said a minute ago that you may come back in 45 days with your report and say that there's a way to start doing this in the second half of this fiscal year.
I think that's what we're looking towards.
Where would that funding come from?
I think in the second report, we would be asking for funding, particularly for DOD, to have staff to conduct these assessments.
And I'd just add that our recommendation to council is to direct us in coordination with the CAO's office to aid us in identifying sources of funding that we could recommend for such a program.
How much do you think we need?
I think that varies, depends entirely on how large of a program we would have.
How many requests do we have? Do you have an estimate of how many requests are out there?
Our department is averaging about 30 per month, and Angela's department is averaging between 70 and 100 per month. What we don't know is how many of those are duplicate requests or the requesters calling back every couple of months to see if the program has been reinstated.
And actually, yesterday, I went through one of our spreadsheets where the month of, I believe, May this year, it was about 90 to 100 people that were new contacts requesting blue curbs.
Okay, now I have several questions.
Sorry.
No, I mean, how much does ballpark it cost to do one?
Radically varying amounts depending upon how much sidewalk repair needs to be done, if there's tree removal required.
Ballpark average.
10, 15,000? About 10, 15,000?
More than that. So
Of course.
if we had to ballpark it, I'd say in the 30 to 40,000 range, depending on how much sidewalk work needs to happen. It actually involves, cutting in several feet and creating a ramp and then cutting it back out. Flow lines need to be addressed and so forth. We may need to remove street trees. There are a lot of, and in the extreme case, street light that would need to be moved. So, and where that type of installation is not considered, where there's restricted roadway width, we may be able to put it at the beginning of the block and take advantage of the curb ramp there. But of course, that may not be in front of the requester's residence.
All right, so let's get honest here. I mean, best case scenario is you're going to be doing a program that's sort of like speed humps, where it's 1 or 2 per council district.
Probably.
That's most likely.
Which is woefully inadequate, horribly unresponsive to the need. And that sounds like your best case scenario.
I think really, quite frankly, the single-family residential program that people are used to is never going to come back the way it was because the requirements are so severe financially. I do think there's a lot of opportunity in the commercial corridors as well as in the multifamily areas. There's more of a public, or more people are benefited by it than the single-family neighborhoods.
Honestly, I think part of what has to happen is we've got to evaluate where the regulations are and how we can ask for some modification of them. I totally understand, yes, this parking space in the residential area is theoretically available to everyone, but on a practical basis, it's being asked to be painted blue for the person who lives nearby with a disability. And this system, while incredibly well-intentioned and maybe exactly how you want to do it in a commercial zone or in front of a park or a senior center, is making the perfect the enemy of the good in a residential area. And, I mean, it's causing real hardship. And it's causing us to be sort of the vehicle of that hardship. So when you do the report back, I'd also like some analysis of which regulatory agencies we should start talking to. And maybe, through League of California Cities or League of Cities, we can try to get some support for doing something that has a different standard, at least in residential areas. The second question I wanted to ask is, because you said something which just concerned me a little bit. You're collecting a list. Why aren't we using a Google Doc where you're entering into the same list so that we know whether or not things are duplicative?
Well, our requests come in through the MyLA DOT system, and
Our requests come in via phone call or email because our department actually doesn't have the technology to take intakes on a system. We've been trying, and it just has not occurred for our department to actually have that ability.
So we will include addressing that concern as part of the workflow, including what technology may be necessary in order to make sure that there is one prioritized list, and the Department of Disability would be the one to be the maintainer of that. And our 6 district offices would flow those requests through them so that we have one point of contact, one list.
On the technology thing, honestly, it's a Google Doc.
Right.
I think DOT and street services have had to start using one on street resurfacing and restriping, right? I mean, it's not, don't come back with a $3 million request for technology.
Yeah.
Mr.
Well, but,
Weezer?
thank you, but on your report back, if we could just see the metrics on several options we could take. So let's say we want to do 20 a month, we want to do 5, 10, 20 a month, whatever it is. And what's the price tag on that, so that we get to see, on average, what we could, what we think we may be able to take. And as you get these requests, they're individually evaluated, correct, and see what it's going to take, is it merited or not. Now, let me point out a different issue we have. We've been called several times in my field offices that we put in a blue stripe, a blue zone years ago. That person has since moved on. And there's a tremendous need for parking in the area. So do we ever go back and evaluate whether we still need that blue zone there or not?
We do remove them regularly. We do request that the adjacent property owner or occupant of that property request the removal, and that's to avoid neighbors falsely calling and request to remove the zone.
Okay, so if we get a call then, and there's been a request to remove it, you guys will look into it and evaluate whether, hey, the person who requested it and needs it is still there or not, if they need it or not, and it can be removed if it's no longer needed.
Yes, we do. We still remove them.
Okay.
Can I make a small request? Can you just let my office know how many requests we have from my district? Do you have a way to tell?
I think Dan can do that.
Another map or another Google document
Sure, we'll work with your.
that
answer that right
Mr.
away.
Bonin can help us with?
We will try to get our list by
I
council
just
district.
know, I get a sense as to how many are in my district, please.
Okay, so just one question on your recommendation before I make or your request. You mentioned, how was it? DOD will serve as primary point of contact for the initial review of all applications. The application will require the adjacent property owner to sign the application. If the applicant cannot obtain approval from the property owner, then DOD, the neighborhood council, council office, or city council can make a determination. That's an or. It's not like you have to get a sign off from all 17 levels of.
We wanted the applicant, if they were requesting a blue zone in front of someone else's house,
Yeah.
and they couldn't get that person to agree to it, to have a way to appeal it through other city agencies where there may be a huge public benefit, and that this determination comes from one of many of these groups that see a public benefit
Just
for that
needs
installation.
one, it doesn't need all of them.
Correct.
All right, cool. So why don't we then, and perhaps my colleagues have additional recommendations, approve your recommendations to come to create the framework and come back in 45 days with that step fleshed out. Also include in that working with the CAO on the financials, including various scenarios as Mr. Weezer has asked for. I'm assuming that we want to have that as a request in the mid-year FSR. 2 is give us recommendations on who the hell to talk to try to reform the process for the residential areas so that we can provide some measure of relief. And 3, tell us what you're doing in terms of Google Docs and simple, cheap, inexpensive technology to merge your lists and more easily sort and track. Colleagues, anything else we want to add? Okay. All right. So that'll be the recommendation. Come back in 45 days. Okay, I see no general public comment today. So that concludes our meeting.